This video covers false prediction number 4. Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution over a roughly 20-year period, from the late 1830s to the late 1850s. But in the early 1850s, Darwin was still grappling with a problem that had been bothering him, and that was diversity. How do you get this great diversity of species that we observe on Earth? How do you get the evolutionary tree with all of its great diversity? Because, of course, Darwin had hypothesized speciation events, but speciation events alone don't give you this great diversity. Well, Darwin solved the problem, much to his satisfaction. He was very happy with his solution. He called it his principle of divergence. And the idea was that competition is greatest between neighbors. So, false prediction number 4. Competition is greatest between neighbors. Let's have a look. So let's begin with an early sketch by Charles Darwin of an evolutionary tree, a notional evolutionary tree, according to Charles Darwin. Where the lines come together to form those nodes, those are speciation events. So what I'm showing there is a speciation event with one line coming in from the bottom and 4 lines coming out. So one species gives rise to 4 species via this speciation event. But why? Why would speciation events occur? And once occurred, why would the different species radiate away from each other and cause so much diversity of life on Earth? And surely that would be what must have happened under evolutionary theory. So Darwin was grappling with that in the early 1850s. Here's how Desmond and Moore describe it. The last major rethink of the theory was underway. Darwin looked at aberrant species, those out on a limb like the peculiar egg-laying platypus, far removed from the rest of creation. Were they ill-adapted and dying out? Had intermediates connecting them with normal animals already become extinct? This brought a flood of new questions. So interjecting here, this is good because it points out how contradictory the theory was, even with Darwin, with the evidence that he had at hand. It wasn't as though the theory was just falling right into place and the evidence fit the theory just so well. Darwin was struggling with the evidence. Continuing. How did animals radiate into every conceivable form, even into broody duck-billed mammals? What caused a species to split into 2? How could selection generate this branching tree of life, the one he had first sketched in his 1837 notebook? The tree was the key. By the 1850s, it was the accepted metaphor among naturalists. Gnarled branches, forking, spreading. It was Darwin's image exactly. He had long visualized nature as irregularly branched. But why should offspring depart from their parents and go a different way? How to explain this forking? I can remember the very spot in the road, whilst in my carriage, when to my joy the solution occurred to me, he later recalled. The cause of the forking. Stressful competition in overcrowded areas, what he called nature's manufactory of species, favored variants that could exploit free niches. These individuals would seize on new opportunities, exploit the available openings on the spot. Interjecting, you'll notice the teleological language there of species seizing on opportunities and exploiting opportunities. Continuing. Isolation on islands was clearly not so crucial as he thought. Competition pried apart dense local populations, fanning them out and forcing a greater number to escape the rat race by finding their own unpressured nook. New varieties were actively pushed away from the parental stock, so species escaped the pressure by finding unoccupied niches in nature's marketplace. Okay, so there's the historical description of Darwin's thinking at the time. Here's an evolution textbook and how it describes it. Biological classifications are hierarchic because evolution has produced a tree-like, diverging, hierarchic pattern of similarities among living things. But why should this be? The question has an important place in the history of Darwin's thinking. He thought up natural selection in the late 1830s as a natural explanation for adaptation and evolution. As environments change and competing species change, species will evolve new adaptations. By itself, this theory does not account for the tree-like divergent course of evolution. Okay, before continuing, I want to point out this phrase here, he thought up natural selection. I like that. You don't often see that in textbooks or popular literature about evolution. Usually Darwin is described as discovering natural selection, or observing, even confirming. Darwin discovered evolution, common descent, natural selection, and so forth. That's not true. He didn't. This was all inferred. He thought up these things to explain what he was observing in nature. So I like that phrase there. Okay, continuing. Darwin needed to explain why species apparently pushed one another apart in evolution. The mechanism he suggested was the relative strength of intra-specific competition. So you have competition within a species causing the speciation event. The competition within a species will be strongest because the individual will encounter more members of its own species, and they will be more similar to it, exploiting more similar resources. One way to avoid competition is to become different from the competitors. Hence, there will be a force pushing similar competing types apart in evolution. Competition between similar individuals will make for the evolution of new adaptations in each that reduce the intensity of competition. Divergence will result. The process is not inevitable. It depends on the contingencies of competition in particular cases. But provided that on average, more similar individuals compete more closely, divergence will take place. Such was Darwin's theory. Indeed. As we will now see, this is all false. A good starting point is Hutchinson's 1961 paper, The Paradox of the Plankton. The problem was too much plankton, too many plankton species coexisting, and too much competition. It shouldn't have happened under Darwin's ideas. He writes, the problem that is presented by the phytoplankton is essentially how it is possible for a number of species to coexist in a relatively isotropic or unstructured environment, all competing for the same sorts of materials. The problem is particularly acute because there is adequate evidence from enrichment experiments that natural waters, at least in the summer, present an environment of striking nutrient deficiency, so the competition is likely to be extremely severe. Okay, so problems in 1961, but we're just getting warmed up here. Let's move forward a few decades to 2014 and this paper, which reads, Darwin argued that closely related species should compete more strongly and be less likely to coexist. For much of the last century, Darwin's hypothesis has been taken at face value. Here we report the results of a study that tested the influence of phylogenetic relatedness on the prevalence of both competition and facilitation among 28 pairs of freshwater green algal species that span a large gradient in phylogenetic distances. And here's the picture of eventually what they had for their experimental setup. A pretty impressive setup there at the University of Michigan. Continuing, as we will show, species interactions among those algae varied from strong competition to facilitation. Yet neither the invasion success nor the interaction strengths were predicted by the evolutionary relationships among species. Our results add to a growing body of literature that fails to support Darwin's original competition relatedness hypothesis, CRH. That's a newer term for Darwin's idea. Okay, another paper here. Quote, a long-standing concept in community ecology is that closely related species compete more strongly than distant relatives. Ecologists have invoked this, quote, limiting similarity hypothesis, that's another phrase for this sort of an idea, another aspect of the idea, to explain patterns in the structure and function of biological communities and to inform conservation, restoration, and invasive species management. However, few studies have empirically tested the validity of the limiting similarity hypothesis. So interjecting here again, we're seeing that the theory had been driving the thinking and there had been little testing, even though you had problems dating back to Hutchinson and so forth. But the evolutionary ideas dating back to Darwin had been kind of taken for granted. Secondly, this is important. All of this is important. As you see here, this sort of thinking and these results are driving or is heavily informing conservation, restoration, and invasive species management. So this is important. Okay, continuing. We found no evidence that the strength of species interactions was influenced by their evolutionary relatedness. There was no relationship between phylogenetic distance and the average minimum nor maximum interaction strength across all biculture communities. Ecologists may need to reevaluate the previously assumed generality of the limiting similarity hypothesis. Indeed. Another paper states, these findings question the expectation that distant relatives should more readily coexist. And another paper, the expectation that close relatives experience greater competition than distant relatives has become known as the competition relatedness hypothesis, CRH. Again, this goes back to Darwin's ideas. We tested whether the CRH holds in communities where individual species experience interactions with a variety of other taxa, which we call the resident community. So the other earlier studies were just two species commingled together. Here, they're adding more species. Continuing, none of the observed competitive interactions among the algal species were predicted by the relatedness of a species to a resident community. This suggests that the results of prior pairwise studies refuting the competition relatedness hypothesis for green algae can be extended to larger resident communities in which more complex ecological interactions possibly occur. So again, they're just adding more problems here, more confirmations of the falsification of this prediction. And here's another paper. A long-standing aim of ecological research is to understand how evolutionary relatedness influences the strength of species interactions and the ability of species to coexist. Darwin proposed that competition should be strongest between close relatives because they share with each other more traits that influence species interactions, such as habitat use, the types of resources consumed, and potential shared predators. As such, he argued that closely related species should be the least likely to coexist. This idea is now commonly called the competition relatedness hypothesis, which is sometimes extended to suggest that species must evolve to differ by some minimum amount in order to stably coexist, an idea known as the phylogenetic limiting similarity. Continuing, comprehensive tests of this hypothesis are critical because strong support for the CRH could motivate biologists to use phylogenetic distances between species to make important management decisions. Again, this is important. For example, it has already been argued that phylogenetic distances could help prioritize species for conservation that have the greatest ecological uniqueness, help identify species that pose the greatest risk of being invasive, and help maximize the restoration of ecological function in degraded ecosystems. And then skipping down, taken together, our results refute the CRH by confirming that close relatives are no more likely than distant relatives to be in competition, and no more or less likely to co-occur or coexist in the same system. Continuing, we also used the new phylogeny to examine whether patterns of co-occurrence among 99 genera in 1,077 lakes throughout North America were random or non-random with respect to phylogeny. We found a pervasive lack of phylogenetic signal in algal community structure across North America, indicating that evolutionary relatedness does not predict patterns of co-occurrence in the overwhelming majority of algal lake communities. Okay, here's the PR piece of another study. Look at the title here. Cooperation, not struggle for survival, drives evolution, say researchers. Skipping down. Recently, the principles based on competitive interactions for the explanation of biodiversity have been criticized from both theoretical and empirical approaches. Continuing, since Hutchinson proposed the provocative paradox of plankton, a series of alternative hypotheses has been proposed to explain why the principle of competitive exclusion is not found in real nature. The reason probably lies in the fact that ecologists have not questioned some of the principles of evolution. Indeed, And next to this paper, one of the more surprising and interesting results of our study is that many algal species experience facilitation in biculture, and that facilitation was associated with a greater likelihood of coexistence. In conclusion, in contrast to the widely held notion that phenotypic similarity leads to a competitive exclusion, we found that similarity in gene expression among species across the transcriptome tends to lead to weaker competition, more likely facilitation, and greater coexistence. So we're seeing a long list here of falsifications of this prediction, coming at it from different angles. So finally, a PR piece on this research. And this PR piece has quotes from the researchers, and so we'll start out with an extended quote from one of the researchers here. "It was completely unexpected. We sat there, banging our heads against the wall. Darwin's hypothesis has been with us for so long. How can it not be right? We went into it assuming Darwin to be right, and expecting to come up with some real numbers for conservationists. When we started coming up with numbers that showed he wasn't right, we were completely baffled. If Darwin had been right, the older, more genetically unique species should have unique niches and should compete less strongly, while the ones closely related should be ecologically similar and compete much more strongly. But that's not what happened. We didn't see any evidence of that at all. We found this to be so in field experiments, lab experiments, and surveys in 1,200 lakes in North America. We should be able to look at the tree of life, and evolution should make it clear who will win in competition and who will lose. But the traits that regulate competition can't be predicted from the tree of life." Skipping down, the researchers were so uncomfortable with their results that they spent the next several months trying to disprove their own work, but the research held up. Indeed. Okay, so we've seen a very clear prediction and a very clear falsification, no question about it. What about the all-important outcome? Was there a smoking gun? Was there a resolution to this problem? Well, no, not at all. What we will see is a long list of possible explanations. Evolutionists have put forward ideas such as a phenotypic plasticity, rapid evolution, convergent evolution. Competition genes are evolving differently, more mutualism than expected, species are co-evolving, and the list goes on and on. There are problems with this list, with these explanations. So what are these problems? Well, first of all, lack of empirical evidence. There just is little or no independent evidence for any of these. In fact, there are problems with some of them. The phenotypic plasticity is not indicated, at least in the case of the algae. So what we have here is the evidence is being driven by the theory rather than the theory being driven by the evidence. Secondly, ad hoc explanations. These are ad hoc explanations used to solve this isolated problem. This isn't like a general solution. Third, they negate the purpose of Darwin's principle of divergence. In other words, Darwin thought up the principle of divergence to solve a problem with his theory. He needed the principle of divergence and these other ideas that have come out of it. And most of these explanations forfeit this principle of divergence. You lose this idea of speciation occurring because of, for a reason. So you lose the reason for the speciation events and the radiations that occur after that. So it doesn't help. And finally, they make evolution a tautology. What do I mean by that? Evolutionists have a portfolio of explanatory mechanisms that can explain basically any outcome, and evolution then becomes merely a restatement of whatever we discover about nature. So whenever you have these problems, and we'll see this more and more in these false predictions, evolutionists just come, even for flat-out falsifications of a prediction that was strongly held, oh, well, they can just change their mind. Evolution predicts X. We discover not X. Oh, that's fine. We can predict that too, or we can explain that as well. So evolution can explain anything, and it loses its value, its scientific value. I'm reminded of the phrase "round up the usual suspects." There's always these lists of explanatory mechanisms. So let me show you a concluding remark in one of the papers, a paper that goes through some of these explanations, which clearly are not very compelling, and then they end up with this statement. The key point here is that several distinct evolutionary and ecological scenarios could explain why our results do not support the competition relatedness hypothesis. In other words, they can't really stand by any of these explanatory mechanisms that they list, and then they just end up with this conciliatory statement. The authors think they are saving the theory, but they're actually ruining the theory. It's exactly this sort of thing that just makes the theory of evolution into a tautology. It can't be falsified. So we have a prediction, we have a falsification, we have a response. It didn't work out. So what can we say about the theory virtues? Back to our table here: evidential accuracy, causal adequacy, internal consistency, internal coherence, universal coherence, simplicity, durability, and fruitfulness. Well, evidential accuracy, once again, a false prediction doesn't do you very well for evidential accuracy. Causal adequacy, no. What we're seeing is just speculations that even the evolutionists don't stand by. What about internal consistency? Well, no, we do have contradictory components. The competition traits, for some reason, don't follow the other traits. Evolution is gradual, except when it is rapid. Rapid evolution erases phylogenetic signal, but phylogeny is the basis of evolution. So we have a lot of internal contradictions here. What about internal coherence? Well, no, we certainly do see theoretical components being tacked on to solve an isolated problem. What about universal coherence? No, the evolutionary tree calling for massive number of speciation events followed by enormous distances to be traveled by individual random mutations one at a time certainly does not sit well with other warranted beliefs such as statistical mechanics. What about simplicity? Well, no, clearly not. The many explanatory mechanisms once again make the theory far more complex, violating Occam's razor. Durability? No, the theory does not survive testing by successful prediction. That's not happening. I think fruitfulness, you could argue one way or the other. Certainly, as we saw, the theory was driving the ideas, and there was a lack of research. There was just an acceptance of this idea that more similar species should have more competition and so forth. And even though you had some papers come out indicating that wasn't happening still, people just stuck with the idea because of the theory was driving people's thinking. So you could say there was a lack of fruitfulness. But on the other hand, recently there's been a lot of good research, as we've seen in these papers, and they've led to other ideas probably. So I guess I'd give it a pass and say, okay, fruitfulness, yeah, that one's okay. So I think what we have here is a failure on the other theory virtues. So big failure, once again, false prediction number 4. Religion drives science, and it matters.